You're listening to a Life in Quebec podcast. For more, visit lifeinquebec.com.
I'm Andrew Greenfield from lifeinquebec.com, and welcome to week 9 of Election Perspectives, where we look at what's happened on the campaign trail during the 2015 Canadian federal election. I'm joined as ever by Colin Standish, a political science graduate and former prospective Liberal candidate for the riding of Compton-Stanstead in the eastern townships of Quebec. Colin, welcome.
Hi Andrew, nice to talk to you again.
So we'll go straight into this week's questions. There was a debate on Friday night, in French language debate on TVA, the face-à-face or face-to-face debate. The stakes were high in Friday's debate, and as far as many were concerned, Friday night's debate was Gilles Ducep's last chance to prove the relevance of his party, the Bloc Québécois, and arguably of his career in this election. Mr Mulcair needs to stop the hemorrhaging of his party's popularity towards its uncertain Quebec base if he wants to remain relevant. Did they both succeed, do you think?
Yeah, no, certainly there was 2 debates in the past week. There was the Monk debate and the French language debate, and of critical importance obviously was the latter. So I think that Mr. Ducep and Mr. Mulcair actually fell very short of where they needed to be. Not bad performances, but I think Mr. Mulcair has not shored up his Quebec base whatsoever. That Mr. Trudeau, where he was considered sort of, a bit listless in the first debate, that he wasn't seen as that peppy, that I think he was rather front and center for this one. Obviously, Mr. Harper was just sort of, standing in the background, just trying, as incumbents do, just you win by not losing. So I don't think he definitively lost, but he just sort of has to stand there and bring out a few of his talking points to ensure that he can take enough away of the vote in certain regions of Quebec. So I don't feel anyone was overall that successful. I don't feel Mr. Ducep has put the Bloc back on the radar, but they are moving up in the polls. Mr. Mulcair as well, I don't think has stopped the hemorrhaging of the NDP. We see throughout the country that they're not doing particularly well, but I feel in Quebec that now suddenly we've broken down, as I've always said, into regional races. You see Montreal, parts of the townships in Western Quebec are really Liberal NDP. You have the Conservatives fighting from the Saguenay down to the Beauce, with Quebec City, obviously. They're really targeting that, the Conservative Party of Canada. Then the Bloc throughout much of very francophone Quebec, from Montreal up to Quebec City, down to the townships. You have 3-way battles there. And then in the Gaspé, you still also have some Liberal Bloc NDP ones shaping up. So I think as the NDP vote narrows, is where those votes converting to is a big question.
So what could or should Tom Mulcair's NDP do then that they're not doing at the moment? What could they do differently?
That's a great question. So I think the NDP has made a big tactical error in this regards, and I think I've said this before, but I feel that they've alienated their core constituency, sort of that righteous voice of Parliament, sort of the conscience of Parliament, I think they've called themselves in the past. I think they've left it to the side that really they took out social democracy from their constitution several years ago. They elected Thomas Mulcair over Brian Topp in 2013, so really embracing the Quebec wing of the party, and that is often associated with nationalism and separatism, as I've sort of have called them out at times, and many other commentators have, and so they sort of embrace a different, I think, identity that. And they've left a lot of their core conscience to the side as well. They've said they're not going to run budget deficits. They're really very conservative in many of their budgetary measures and social programs. You don't really see this big vision for Canada coming through, I feel. So I think that they really alienated a lot of their core constituency in the left of Canada, left some head scratching as how much have they left to the side in their pursuit of power.
Okay.
And as well, so that's my perspective, that I think they threw many of the original policies under the bus.
Okay, so interesting take on things. Now, one notable absentee was the Green Party's Elizabeth May. She wasn't there on Friday's debate. That's possibly stifling a party that's represented in Parliament and presents candidates in every riding across Canada. And barring the only woman in the game from participating in the debates, how does that sit with you?
It doesn't sit very well. I think that obviously that all party leaders, certainly ones represented in Parliament, that there should be a cut-up. But the one thing is, I think they only ask official parties to be there, so you need 12 seats or more. But then obviously the Bloc Québécois that Mr. Duceppe, I believe, only has 2 seats in Parliament at dissolution. He himself didn't have a seat. So, no, I'm very uncomfortable that obviously that all voices, certainly with any legitimacy of being a party in Parliament, but you also had Force and Democratie that they weren't invited there with 2 seats. So that was a bit, that they should be invited as well, I feel. Not that I am, sympathetic to their point of view, but no, that Elizabeth May wasn't there, that she was the only female, I think is reprehensible. And as well, I think Mr. Duceppe should have been invited to all the English debates as well.
So basically, in the interest of fairness, is what you're saying.
Interest of fairness. I mean, it's up to Canadians to determine whether their voices are legitimate or not, and certainly to have a very basic litmus test of, okay, they're party leaders. Is this party registered candidates across the country? Yes, yes, yes. I think it's, as you said, stifling a voice that needs to be heard.
Now, also, that was interesting from the Friday debate. Now, it was held in Quebec and it was a French debate, but there are millions of French speakers, first language French speakers across Canada. They were ignored again, weren't they?
I completely agree, and it's reprehensible, I believe, and I think it has been suggested. I think you brought it up in the Life in Quebec, one of our interviews, is that why don't we have a French debate outside of Quebec and have an English debate maybe in Quebec? And I think that would be a wonderful thing for official languages. That it reminds me of when Joseph Cartier and I believe it was George Brown, that they switched seats. That one of them, that Cartier ran in York, and then I believe George Brown ran in Trois-Rivières. That they switched seats in the 1850s, right, to show national unity. When you had United Canadas before Canada was actually a country, it was a united colony. So I really think that we should have those measures, those gestures of inclusivity. So I couldn't agree more that I think we need to be, to recognize that there are French Canadians outside of Quebec. Is something I've always stood for, and I've certainly stood for minority language rights in Quebec, as you well know as well, and any readers of Life in Quebec would know. Okay,
so a significant part of Friday's debate actually talked about the use of Canada's military fighting ISIS or ISIL, call them what you will. Now, this is an issue on which the big 3 parties differ significantly. How does each party's position hold up to Canadians' expectations, do you think?
That's a great question. And certainly foreign policy often falls to the wayside, but we had the Monk debates. So basically it seems, as far as I can understand, obviously the conservative policy is the policy of the government. So very, that we've done, I believe is it over 100 sorties at this point, or even I think it's 1,000 actually, different missions. It's sorry, I should get my facts straight. I knew them several weeks ago. My apologies to the viewers, but it's 100 or 1,000. We've been very involved in the fighting against ISIL. So that's a government policy. That's a Conservative Party, is to fight along with the allies there. The Liberal Party of Canada seems to want to just re-gear towards training different military operatives in those regions, but it really is hard to tell friend from foe in this fight. And as now we have Russia that's actually come into the game and have started bombing in Syria, so that's interesting. And obviously they back the Assad regime, which no one really backs, but of course the alternative is sort of ISIL militants or aligned militants. So it's really a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. And then with the NDP, they really want to retract it completely from that altercation. So I think that Canadians are being asked a very sophisticated foreign policy question. That we're not as involved obviously as the Afghanistan war, but my perspective is we can't walk away. That I think military intervention is legitimate in this case. I think Mr. Mulcair's point on that, we should only back NATO and UN sanctioned missions, and this ISIL intervention is not either of those things. I think that's a very legitimate point, that when it comes to international sovereignty, we must act, within the international framework of public international law. But I am one of or personally of my opinion that we do have an obligation now that we are involved militarily, certainly not to walk away from it. I think that Mr. Trudeau's point and Mr. Mulcair's point on having international legitimacy and also backing and also training others to that's a responsible way of going forward. I do agree with both those points. So I'm actually of personal opinion that all 3 parties have legitimate views on this issue.
Now, Thomas Mulcair has said, he was on a CBC interview, a televised interview with Peter Mansbridge 2 or 3 weeks ago. He said that if he becomes Prime Minister of Canada, the Canadian troops are coming home. It's simple as that. Yep. They're all coming home. Now, is that going to win him votes, do you think?
It'll win. that's a great question. I mean, it's interesting that Mr. Duceppe in the Bloc, we didn't discuss that in the previous question, but they've sort of said intervention, we should fight Islamic terrorism overseas. We don't want it to come to our home base. So that's interesting that often the Bloc, I found it very offensive during the Afghanistan war, saying, Quebecers shouldn't be sent overseas, etc. That was often their line, and because of Al-Qartier and the Vandus, who are obviously stationed in Quebec City, they fought very bravely, and they were exceptional in the Battle of Afghanistan. So I really, I feel that I don't feel it's responsible to say that, we should cut and run and bring our troops back from overseas. But does it appeal to his core constituency in English Canada? I would say so. There's a lot of very pacifists here in Canada who just want to see peacekeeping be our primary objective for foreign policy. And then in Quebec, obviously, there's many people very uncomfortable. The conscription crises in World War I and World War II still remain in the minds of many French Canadians and other Quebecers. So I think it does win him votes in his core constituency, to be honest.
Okay, now moving to a lighter moment slightly. One funny thing that happened on Friday night, well, funny for many, was when during the face-à-face or the face-to-face, there was one particular question. And it was addressed to Justin Trudeau and Gilles Duceppe, and in the heat of the moment, Mr. Trudeau turned to Mr. Duceppe, and instead of saying "mon ami," he said "mon amour." Now the internet went nuts based on that. The memes are out there. For us watching, it was funny. It was a slip of the tongue that he corrected instantly. Gilles Duceppe's face was an absolute picture. It was fabulous. But is Mr. Trudeau handling the pressure? Is he slipping, do you think?
I think that was it was a lighthearted moment. The look on Gilles Duceppe's face was rather amusing, and Mr. Trudeau kind of stumbled after that moment. But I think it was, that our politicians are saying they're in love with each other and on live TV in front of millions of people. You know what? We live in a great country, if that's a fact. So I think it was a funny, lighthearted moment. I don't think it's representative of Mr. Trudeau being sort of a fish out of water, that he's performed very admirably in debates and sort of surpassed the expectations. That's sort of what most commentators would say, and certainly my own personal opinion. So, no, I think it was a funny, lighthearted moment. I think the tweet was funny in response that he reassured his wife, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, that she was his true love. So I thought it was a lighthearted moment that resonated well with Canadians.
Okay, now one thing that's happening or not happening during this campaign is that the provincial premiers are remaining relatively quiet. Is that normal? Has that happened in previous campaigns? Are they just like keeping their own counsel, or what are they doing?
No. There's you have seen a few interventions by Mrs. Wynne here in Ontario. That Trudeau really helped her campaign during 2013. It's a bit forgotten, but and also Liberal parties of Quebec and Canada are pretty much fused in Ontario. They're much more synergy than there would be in Quebec, where there's some overlap, but really there's feuding as well. So Premier Wynne has come out very strongly in favor of him, that I think she sort of owes him one from 2013. You've seen Brad Wall talk a little bit in Saskatchewan, but he hasn't been too interventionist. But during the Senate debates about the Senate, he's piped up. You have seen the Premier Couillard, that he has issued sort of Quebec's demands and wanted an official response from every party. But generally, there's sort of a hands-off approach that you saw in the Quebec election in 2014. People were very worried that the PQ was going to win, sort of looking down the barrel of a gun at referendum 3.0. To a certain extent, looking at the Charter of Values, maybe a renewed Bill 14, the language law. So you really didn't see them intervene that heavily. That really, that there is sort of that non-interventionist approach between federal and provincial parties and governments, and that's something that I think is generally appropriate. That you wouldn't really want to see a provincial government mobilize their entire resources at a federal campaign. What would that mean? That suddenly provincial parties and resources are determining the election of federal candidates, and then really are these people just a puppet of federal governments or parties? To be honest, that's sort of what happened in my nomination campaign, that the provincial and municipal elements sort of came into the federal Liberal Party, and really that organizational backing is what sort of defeated me in my nomination race. It's sort of maybe an untold story. I haven't talked about it too much, and I'm not too happy about it, that it sort of broke that unofficial rule of, well, you really don't muck in each other's backyards. So that's my personal experience in that I had the opposite happen to me. But I think we could see, it would be very detrimental to see the different governments and parties overlap, and you would see some very nasty things going on.
So their voices can make a difference then, can't they?
mean, they did personally. My nomination race that it was local, provincial, and municipal politicians and their backers who really, just down to the wire, ensured that I didn't win. That was my personal experience, and not to talk just about mine, but I experienced it, and I don't, and just obviously I have some bitterness about that subject, but can be very unhealthy if really, what if federal politicians or provincial politicians were indirectly basically elected through the organizational backbone of another party, and this does happen to a certain extent, but you could really see some funny business going on, and really who's in power? Is it the province taking over the federal government to a certain extent, or the federal government taking over a province? I don't think Canadians would really want to see this.
Well, we're gonna see whether it's made a difference or not in the next couple of weeks or so. Sure. Now, just sort of concentrating on the Quebec element for a second. The Bloc have been quite active. Are they on the rise again in Quebec province, do you think?
Yeah, no, I think you're seeing a little rebound. I think you're seeing that they're getting that. I mean, there is a core 20 to 40% of Quebecers. I think it's generally around 25 to 30% of this core very sovereignist, independent-minded vote. So I don't think that's going away, and that eats more into the NDP slice of the electorate, and to a certain extent the Conservative side of the electorate. Not so much, obviously. The Liberal Party of Canada is very associated with federalism and national unity. But I took a look today at the polls. This was really interesting, Andrew. I took a look at Gaspé, Île-de-la-Madeleine, so the Magdalen Islands, and they're considered a bellwether riding to take a look at in provincial and federal elections. They usually vote with the winner, and I looked at the polls today, and you saw a four-way split between the Conservatives, Bloc, NDP, and Liberals. They were all about 25%, give or take 2 or 3 percentage points, and I thought that was fascinating. This is a bellwether riding, mostly francophone, though you still have a core anglophone element there that is very undecided between 4 parties, and that's quite fascinating what a battleground Quebec has become.
One thing that the leaders are battling on at the moment is marijuana, pot smoking. Now, Mr. Harper and Mr. Trudeau's positions differ hugely on this. One wants it legalised, the other is claiming it's worse than tobacco. Who should we believe?
On this point, it is interesting that it's coming up. I think ultimately, in my mind, from a public policy point of view, would be decriminalization. That legalization for me, I wouldn't want to see. This is a personal point of view, and it's based in public policy. Research I've seen, but I wouldn't want to see marijuana, joints sold next to cigarettes, sold next to tobacco. And obviously alcohol and tobacco probably actually cause more deaths and cause much deviant behavior, certainly with alcohol. So it's sort of a pick your poison mentality. But I think decriminalization is probably the public policy point that really, for several joints or several grams or whatever amount, really putting kids in jail or having criminal convictions for this, for minor amounts really doesn't make much sense. And it has barred, I think, 500,000 Canadians from entering the United States, right, if you have a drug charge in another country. So I think the Liberal Party's point of view it meets up with also public opinion that Canadians don't really want to see marijuana as a large criminal offense, but I think people are uncomfortable with it being sold in the streets and taxed, and that's sort of Liberal Party's point of view. So I think the public policy solution is to decriminalize it very thoroughly, and so that differs from the Liberal Party of Canada's and from the Conservatives, which is just sort of keep it illegal, keep it criminalized. But there are arguments as well. Liberal parties is very interesting to actually tax it, make sure there's programs out there, make sure it's subsidizing healthcare, so to make it legalized, and also it takes sort of soft money out of other illegal activities like gangs and whatnot. So there's a very legitimate point of view for the Liberal Party of Canada as well.
Okay, so a couple of weeks to go to Judgment Day, as it were, before we all go and vote. Who's leading the race to Sussex Drive?
I think on that point your guess would be as good as mine, but I just look at the polls today, so it really it seems, if we're going to believe the polls, and I'm not a big person who believes, I believe in the numbers in politics, but polling, and even aggregate polls, you got to take them with a grain of salt. It could be off 3 or 4%, but it looks like the Conservatives have about 32, 33% of the vote. They're looking to capture 133 seats. Liberals right now 95 seats. I believe the NDP is about 105 seats. So it still is a three-way race, and that's very telling for many reasons. That after a decade in power, the Conservatives have been able to hold on to their core constituency much better than I expected. Right? Remember, let's think back to a time when Mulroney was in power for even 9 years. In 1993, they went down to 2 seats. Think about after Chrétien and Martin were in power for over a decade, or they were in power for 13 years. I mean, people wanted these people out the door so quickly. I mean, it couldn't have even been faster, right? I mean, they just wanted these guys out on the street. and Canadians, that still haven't, many Canadians have tired of Harper, but not to the extent that I would have expected after a decade in power. Secondly, another story is the NDP has not totally collapsed in Quebec, nor in the rest of Canada, and as well the Liberal Party of Canada, they're not toast either. I'm a proud member of the Liberal Party of Canada, as has been said numerous times on the program, that is part of my bias, but you know what, they're back in the game, that they're looking that they could form a fiscal opposition or even a minority government, so it's still anyone's guess, Andrew, and it's going to be an interesting race right to the end.
Okay, so basically after 9 weeks, nobody really knows, do they?
Your guess is as good as mine. It's a three-way coin toss, if there is such a thing, and or rolling of the dice, whatever metaphor one wants to use. But yeah, it's up to Canadians to decide, and this is really, in this election, all Canadians, and there's some who are going to vote Bloc Québécois, obviously in Quebec, but you really have the choice between three parties with pretty radical different positions. It isn't like the Liberal Party and the Progressive Conservatives 2 decades ago. You really have three parties with distinctive choices for Canadians, and really how people vote on October 19th will determine the government, and no one's going to know until that moment. So now, I wish Canadians the best of luck in their decision.
One thing that is quite interesting, some people, as you quite rightly said, some people will vote Bloc, and certainly in Quebec, they're out on the streets and they're campaigning. Now, by voting Bloc, who's actually going to gain? Which of the big three parties are going to gain?
Yeah, it's a good question. Is who's eating whose lunch, and is voter convertibility, and so really, I mean, the Bloc Québécois and the NDP are generally seen as interchangeable. That a lot of former Bloc Québécois supporters voted NDP in 2011, and then as well with the Conservatives, though, have generally had a soft nationalist approach. In 2006, that I direct people to Chantal Hubert's a blind date, or French Kiss, a blind date with Quebec, that's written about Harper's sort of open federalism approach with Quebec at that time, which largely failed. So you see convertibility on both sides, that Bloc votes can go between the NDP and the Conservatives, not really with the Liberal Party of Canada, generally that very core federalist vote, and also minorities in Quebec generally, except for the 2011 election, vote for the Liberal Party of Canada, certainly in the Montreal region. So that's the way I see the breakdown and the convertibility of electoral intentions.
Okay, fair enough. Now, Colin, we're almost out of time, but just to finish off, other than the Mon Amour comment from the debate the other night, has anything quirky or funny caught your eye this week at all?
To be honest, that's pretty much the biggest one. You've seen there's some graffiti on streets or signs in Montreal that there's some very offensive, but there's a few. I'd recommend some people Google it, but you can see that Justin Trudeau signs are sort of getting a lot of graffiti. So some of it can be offensive, but some of it's rather amusing. But some little comments about the Mon Amour joke, and so I'd recommend, if you want to, you can Google graffiti of not that I recommend anyone actually graffiti a sign. I believe that's a federal offense, so please don't see this as an encouragement of that. But I'd encourage all your viewers to take a look at some of the graffiti on street signs. Some of it's rather amusing. So that would be my only lighthearted moment of the week besides the Mon Amour incident.
Well, certainly. Well, as soon as we finish, we're going to go and check that out. Colin, thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Have a good one.
All right. Bye.
Thank you for listening to a Life in Quebec podcast. For more news, editorials, and opinion, visit lifeinquebec.com.